I'm Besa Luce, and welcome to the next episode of Other Talking Points, a K 2.0 podcast. In this episode, I decided to look at social protection. That is, whether and to what extent countries in the region have social schemes and programs that can meaningfully help the most vulnerable and have a meaningful effect on economic mobility. Social protection programs, including pensions, healthcare, and education support, among others, are a prerequisite for social rights. Whether or not someone has access to quality education, to proper care at hospitals, or a secure income determines the quality of that individual's life and the well-being of society overall. Access to adequate social protection becomes particularly critical in times of crises and economic shocks. In the past 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced firsthand how essential social protection is. Many people lost their jobs, industry came to a halt, and medical institutions were in shock. This created a greater awareness of the essential nature of social safety nets. It continued this year when Russia's war in Ukraine also led to global inflation, which degraded the value of people's savings and paychecks, and which put low-income people in an especially vulnerable position. Most countries in the region intervened and rolled out different relief packages that aimed to help more vulnerable groups in society face the added burdens and pressures. However, there's much to explore about the extent to which sustainable systems were already existing and whether responsive measures truly contributed to relief for citizens. I have invited 2 guests to explore these different aspects of social protection. This year, they also co-authored a paper which examines social protection spending and redistribution in the region between the period 2005 to 2016. Maja Gerovska-Mitev is a professor of social policy in North Macedonia. Her research focuses on examining the changing nature of welfare systems and their impact on poverty and social exclusion. And Artan Mustafa, a professor and social policy researcher in Kosovo, whose research focuses on the politics of the welfare state, social policy design, and the social foundations of political parties. Maja and Artan, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Besa, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here and discuss these issues with you today.
Thanks, Besa. It's great to be here to talk to you and Maja about social protection.
Great. So very good to have you. And I would like to actually begin with a paper that you co-authored that was published this year. And as I mentioned earlier, you focused on the welfare systems in countries in the region. And I wanted to ask you, what brought you together for this research? Were there specific practices or patterns that you were particularly keen and interested to compare and contrast in the context of the region? Artan, maybe we can begin with you.
Okay. So we both work also for European Social Policy Network. We were writing technical reports from all the countries on financing social protection, and then Maja said that maybe it would be a good idea to have an academic article about this, focused on the Western Balkans, something that had not been done in this way before due to lack of data and so on and so on. Then there was a conference call organized by London School of Economics and the Faculty of Economics in the University of Belgrade. And Maja saw it and she said, maybe it's good that we send the abstract there. And so it developed from there. There we met with conference organizers, Will Bartlett and his colleagues. And so after the conference, we were supposed to write this paper for as a book chapter first, but then they invited us to submit for a special journal issue. So it was great to cooperate with Maja and just to try to put these data and these trends on the Balkans in this paper is not easy, but maybe we will speak about that later.
And Maya, was there a particular reason that you focused on this period of 2005 to 2016? I mean, Artan did mention that in general, a paper of this kind had been lacking in the context of comparing, contrasting the region. But is there something specific within this time period, or was it just related to data?
Well, I wouldn't say specific, but let's start from the fact that our countries in the region really lack quantitative data indicators related to social protection. So in this aspect, the emergence or let's say the compliance of some of our countries to the European statistics, that is the ESPROS, European Social Protection Integrated System statistics, was one of the reasons why actually this paper was in a way initiated, although as Artan mentioned, it was actually initiated as a technical report for the purposes of this European Social Protection Network. But then, because rarely we have statistical data that are based on the harmonized source, integrated data. So for some of the countries, there is still not, this type of data do not exist. So Artan was really helpful here for doing that data by himself for Kosovo, but also integrating what actually exists for the countries in the region, for Macedonia, for Bosnia, for Serbia and others within this ESPROS database. So it's basically, it's up to the availability of the data and the time period they cover.
Okay, I would like now to maybe start getting a bit into the article, into the text that you wrote, and I think that in the countries in the region, over the years, there has been they have expanded their direct poverty protection through social assistance programs. However, you also argue that in Kosovo, Macedonia, and Albania specifically, government spending still remains small, and it has not changed to adapt to also changing realities. So many current social schemes do not recognize or respond to the needs of many groups in need of assistance. So can you speak a bit about how this affects these people and maybe share some examples of certain groups in need that cannot or do not benefit from social protection programs, and also maybe some examples of when better targeting has been successful?
Okay, in social protection studies and welfare state, we tend to be quite critical about targeting sometimes. Let's start with this because we don't think that's often the best way to fight poverty or help really the support maybe the most fragile social groups, because there are other ways. There could be universal programs that avoid stigma, that avoid mistakes in targeting, and also there are social insurance programs that could have quite similar results. But still, every country has some targeted programs. What we have seen and what we show in this study is that in general, except for Kosovo, and this was due to the heavy international influence after 1999, and also due to the particular circumstances, this break during the 90s and particular socialism legacy, other countries have continued with a dominance of social insurance in their systems, including Albania. So in this sense, they are quite similar with EU countries, in the sense that they are social insurance based. But this social insurance then is not as developed or as complex or as up to date as many similar programs are in the EU. And these targeted programs, minimum income, minimum protection programs, they have increased in the region because during socialism, these were either minimum programs or very, very small programs, almost symbolic, or they didn't exist, for example, in Albania. So also owing to international influence, especially the influence of the World Bank, the countries started to create these programs, but they are not as complex as, or they don't provide social rights as they do in many other countries in Europe, especially in northern part and maybe continental part of Europe. They are often very categorical. For example, some countries like Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia, they don't provide eligibility only to people that don't have necessary income, but then there are also other criteria. For example, women should not be employed, should be single, and mothers of at least a child under 5-year-old, for example, Kosovo. And this then causes a lot of exclusion. It's similar with other, for example, another group is that all people have to be fully dependent. And then the administration sometimes overlooks these rules because they are too tough, too strict, and they qualify people anyway but then this all creates situation where you don't know what rule is being applied. Some regions cover more people, some less people, and so on and so on. Some countries have a little bit better programs. North Macedonia especially, I think, has quite a good definition of the minimum income. So maybe Maya can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, as Artan mentioned, really, in general, in the region, I think we have a tendency, or what we see within the social protection system is this traditional type of social protection scheme, which favors more traditional risks, those being old age. So in that respect, our paper shows that the expenditure for social protection is strongly redistributive towards old age, and less so in terms of child and working age poverty. In Macedonia, for example, in 2019, we had a social protection reform, which in a way improved some of these less targeted programs. So, for example, the social protection programs in Macedonia covers more than 50% of the population, but 40% of the population receives support from social insurance, while close to 14% only from social assistance scheme. So in this respect, the mentioned social protection reform in Macedonia, which was introduced in 2019, actually focused on expanding the coverage in terms of increasing first of all, the equivalence scale, and thus providing those with incomes close to the previous previous equivalent scale, or the entry threshold for the social assistance, or those close to the poverty threshold to enter the scheme. Particularly, the reform was focused on increasing the access to child allowance, and I think here we had a great improvement, not only in terms of coverage of children, but also in terms of using or having the benefits to combine the existing benefits from the social protection scheme. For example, in the past, beneficiaries of a minimum income scheme could not actually use the child allowance, which was really discriminatory in a way, so to say. So we also increased the combination of the possibility of combining different benefits, and thus at the end coming with the improved coverage for the vulnerable population. But mainly I would say that the success of this reform was improvement of the coverage of child allowance and child benefits.
Yeah, and if I can add something, Besa, also you mentioned the pandemic in your introduction. I think pandemic also was quite useful to show us some limitations of the minimum income schemes, and then we see in many countries that governments reacted by increasing payments and creating easier qualification rules, and so on and so on. This improved the protection of the poorest often, And we see that reflected also in some statistics that have become, in the meantime, available. So that's a good learning. And it's a way to see how these programs can be improved. But as Maya said, and we show also in this article, that for that period of time, we see something strange, for example, which is very different with the EU. Much more poverty for working age and especially children population is reduced by pensions than by other social protection programs. And this shows just that they were really very underdeveloped. But in the meantime, there have been positive developments, as Maya said. In some countries, there have been improvements of child protection schemes. Kosovo, for example, now has introduced a universal program, which is very good. It's one of the best, really, in terms of the coverage, not only in our region but in all Eastern Europe. And then the same has been developing also in Montenegro, but it covers children population from 0 to 6 years old. But beyond cash, we need to see progress in services. This is one of the weakest points of social protection programs in the Western Balkans. This is where they lack, and countries that really serve as or regimes that serve as ideal types to compare situations in our region have very good services, universal services, and also have other programs that especially focus on the working age population to support maximum employment and the time between employment and leaves, and also early childhood education and care services, and they have a more balanced tax structure. All these elements combine to produce results.
I want to just go a bit back at the pandemic and what it exposed, and you talked a bit about that, Artan, and I think another thing that it exposed was how which we already knew, but made it more visible, maybe just how big the informal market, labor market in Kosovo is, because when the government introduced packages of support during the second year of the pandemic, a lot of people that were working at the beginning, they couldn't necessarily apply for that assistance because they were not registered workers. They were working informally. And then they had to also amend a bit to take those people into account. Where do these people that are working in the informal sector stand when it comes to the way social protection, the system in Kosovo is set up?
Well, I mean, informality has been quite high in all the region, and also is not new. It has been there also before, but in the case of Kosovo, it has been also helped, unfortunately, by the general social policy that we have here. It is very liberal, market-oriented. The tax structure is focused on consumption. So most of our national revenues come from consumption taxation, and so the government instrumentally was not so interested often what is happening in the labor market. So this is one of consequences. When the pandemic arrived, the government tried to help people with no income. So they were not qualified officially as poor, but they also didn't have income. Then it found very difficult to provide this support because it took 1 year to implement a scheme, and this just shows that if you don't have well-functioning programs, when times of crisis arrive, then people will suffer from it. Also, another element that we learned is that the government also tried to protect people that lost jobs from the pandemic, but it didn't have an unemployment protection scheme at all. Other countries have it, at least, even if it's often quite symbolic, as in Albania. But due to lack of infrastructure and knowledge to provide unemployment protection, only a few hundred people receive this protection, and this just shows that you need a complex social protection system to be there. If not, even if it's not so complex, you will need it in times of crisis.
And Maya, do you think that the governments in the region have maybe also learned from the pandemic to apply, let's say, those lessons now with the rising inflation? Because now we're going through another crisis very, very quickly. People are getting poorer as a result of the inflation. How would you compare support relief packages from designed at the time of the pandemic and then also now in the inflation? If you can just give us some examples.
Yes, absolutely. The pandemic has prepared us to act or to make governments aware for the need of quick reaction of the social protection systems, because we do have systems in place, but how, to whom, and how fast they react is also very important. So in that respect, for example, the case in Macedonia is that some of the improvements of the social protection system were temporary. So during the pandemic, for example, those who lost jobs were in position to use the unemployment protection from the social insurance scheme, regardless of the number of days that they were employed, which was not the regular condition. Normally, they have to be at least 9 months employed. Even then, there are some restrictions. Why did you leave your jobs and so on? So in that respect, this was really a temporary type of protection, which I hope now, when we are faced again with this energy crisis, will be considered again that the systems need to be free of these, so to call, institutional barriers for the people to access protection when they need it. I see in Macedonia that, again, there are some lessons learned from the pandemic are implemented now, so there is a fast response in terms of energy or financial support for so to say, energy bills for the most vulnerable. But again, there is this categorical approach. So some are more vulnerable than the others. So we see a preference probably in terms of numbers of beneficiaries and how much the budget can allow to support different groups. But there is a segregation. Some of them are more, let's say, beneficiaries of social pension, or the elderly above 65 who are not part of the social pension are seen as eligible, but beneficiaries of the guaranteed minimum assistance are not. So, because they regularly have this support. So we have this discrepancy because in terms of who is eligible for what, and it's not really always based on data, and sometimes it's very arbitrary.
It's also, I mean, when it's not based on data, then it means that it's also linked to who's in power, who's in government at a particular moment in time. And I want to go back to pensions programs afterwards, but since I already mentioned the issue of governments, I'm going to continue in this line, because we haven't, as a region, I mean, and there's a lot of, I guess, reasons for it, but I feel like we haven't really developed strong, let's say, left political parties that truly have at the core of the program equality and justice, and also think of equity and versus equality. I don't know if you would agree with this, since you mentioned, Tartan, earlier, more universal approach. We do have a left party now in Kosovo, in Albania, but not necessarily translating into socially responsible policies in that regard. So also politically, of course, I think for some years it's also because of the legacy of socialism and communism, and then there was a rejection of the left without actually understanding and accepting that the left has different forms and shapes. So how do you see this with regard to how social protection then is designed?
Well, I think one of the reasons, as you said yourself, is that we have a particular context where many of our there is a state formation that came through communism, socialism, and so the state formation, state building, especially in terms of social policy, social protection, didn't come through a Western trajectory where so as you said, immediately after the 90s, for these countries and for the elites in these areas, it was much more important to work for these Euro-Atlantic integration, and there was not so much ideological competition and so on and so on. But we see that now changing at least in these last few years. For example, as I said, this child protection scheme in Kosovo came after a government change. There were a few things that I saw in Albania, for example, more progressive taxation, social protection for old people without social insurance, a scheme for that, and programs like that. But I wouldn't say still, the left is the main agency behind the social protection development. Maybe that will come. I hope it comes. In many other countries, for example, we see that in Latin America, for example, the arrival in power of the left wing often has caused a little bit move away from these very radical privatization ideas and programs. Something that is also being reflected in our region in moments, but at the same time, there are also other developments in Central Europe, for example, that tend towards populism, and that would not be very helpful, I think. So that is manifested, for example, with programs that tend to be quite conservative, like long leaves for mothers who bring children to life, and children protection schemes and so on and so on, but they don't have the aim of social investment or maximizing employment for both genders and so on, and mobility that you mentioned earlier, but they are more conservative. So we see both these developments.
Maya, how do you see decision in this regard?
Yes, well, two things really I want to say. First, regardless of the political ideology in power, I feel there is this dominant perception of the policymakers in the region that we need to protect the welfare system or the welfare state from potentially undeserving applicants, those mostly being people who are in the informal market. And our countries are really in this aspect a favorable zone. So it's always this battle when you confront policymakers, when you want to suggest something that is more comprehensive, that allows access to these rights. It's but they already work, so we should make this and this barrier and so on. So it's really like protecting the system from undeserving, which is the main mantra, and which really forbids the more comprehensive or more favorable or more universal access to these rights. And second, even when we have so to say political party in power that is leftist or it's more favorable towards the comprehensive social protection, if there is no consistency within the party itself between different ministers of social policy and finance, or social policy minister and then the next one who comes after this who was more favorable, we see really mixed policy messages and even conflicting trends. Just to explain this with one example. In Macedonia in 2019, we had this good combination of a very willing policy minister of social finance and social policy, who were eager and who introduced this social protection reform, both from the financial aspects, that meaning introducing or reintroducing this progressive taxation. Previously it was flat rate. And then the social protection, which I previously mentioned, enhanced the rights of child allowance and access to guaranteed minimum income. The same political party, throughout 2019, with the combination of this financial and social protection reform, we saw, or the data showed, that there was a decrease in inequality. Although it was symbolic, it was still a decrease. And we had some positive trends in terms of also reduction of at risk of poverty rate. But that same political party actually rolled back its own political priorities and goals. So it rolled back the progressive taxation, which in a way then also conflicted with how income inequality trends are now. We can see an increase in the inequality. So really a consistency. So you can say, regardless if there is a leftist party in power, you can still not count on these policies which are more universal, more comprehensive, more accessible for all.
I would like to connect here also with the role that the EU has played in the region in this regard, because you mentioned it also in your paper that while, of course, due to EU investment, there's been a lot of improvement in different sectors with regard to, let's say, largely like governance, rule of law and whatnot, but that they have not necessarily carried the same legacy when it comes to social protection. Why is that?
Well, I think that's also in the. It has been the case for most of the time. I think the EU was not involved so much in social protection, especially in our region. So much more development agencies like World Bank or IMF and similar, and they were interested in promoting these targeted programs and so on, and reducing social insurance. I don't know why the European Union has not been so much involved. Maybe because these agencies just had more credibility, especially, for example, in context of Kosovo or maybe even Albania, being based in Washington. There was a lot of public trust and so on. And really, European Union also didn't have a common position on where how social protection should develop. Some literature says that even EU should be understood as one of these agencies that promoted privatization and liberalization and so on. But despite the big changes in the Balkans with wars and massive transformations, still there is something different. This element of social insurance has survived in most of the countries, and in this sense they are quite similar with EU. So maybe over time there will be some convergence there, and some countries learn from other countries to react. We see, for example, because the power of left, if we go back to your previous question, in our region and in Southeastern Europe, has been understood also in terms of the capacity to resist these privatization, liberalization ideas. Not only because if it was not in a position to expand social protection, at least often was quite successful in resisting and protecting what was there. So only now we're seeing more emphasis on the expansion, and the EU now has come up with these EU pillar of social rights, so we see more emphasis on social rights now. Maybe that will come up, but of course we would like also to have much more local discussion and conversation dialogue about these programs, these topics. So what we see, for example, often in the public discourse is an understanding of social protection much more as a burden on governments and revenues and so on, and little understanding of them as social investment, as programs that maximize social mobility, employment rates, and so on, and protect risks, which then would incentivize employment and so on. So these aspects are not so much mentioned in the public. In the coming years, if this populist movement doesn't really become so mainstream, I would expect both a rise of the left and also more involvement of the EU, especially after the introduction of EU pillar of social rights.
Yeah, I think there's also something interesting in what you said now, Artan, because I think especially in the context of Kosovo, after 1999, after the war, more generally, everybody just embraced or understood democracy merely along very neoliberal capitalist market structures, and that was seen as the only way that a democracy can be built and it should function. And I think it affects what you said, that people view social protection as a burden and not necessarily as an investment. But I think we're going now through also a change of generations, and we're seeing a lot more voices, whether it comes to like social protection, but not only, when it comes to also, I think, environment and gender equality and whatnot. So there is this momentum. But to go back to you mentioned the World Bank in this regard as a big investor in Kosovo, providing assistance, let's say, with regard to social protection, and also leading in a sense. And these are usually very rigid structures as well. And there's been different cases in Kosovo where there was also assistance that was conditioned to the government based on government policies and whatnot. So what space also exists, what leverage space exists also for governments to have, let's say, more independence and authority over how they design such programs, especially when international structures provide big support?
Well, the literature says that, for example, some countries that had a lot of debts, for example, or had a really bad economic condition, they were more prone to influence. Then some other literature says also that, okay, these international development agencies, they are themselves prone to new influences. If new ideas come up, they will change a little bit. In the case of Kosovo, the debt was not a big issue, but this popularity and the fact that it is a state that came through international state building. But there are also some good things to learn from this influence also for the region, I would say. Due to this influence, for example, we have a very particular program, the Universal Basic Pension, that no other country in the region has. And that has been very good. It avoids these mistakes of mean targeted programs. It covers people well geographically and so on. It has been gender-wise very good. So that's something that was worth it, and also the region and other countries can learn. Something on the idea behind the health care system was also good, because contrary to other countries in the region, in Kosovo, if you are a citizen of Kosovo and resident of Kosovo, you can go. That's enough to take the service, what is there. Of course, the service is not so complex, but this is quite universal. In other countries, it is based on social insurance, and then if you have a social insurance program but high levels of unemployment, you could risk some exclusion and so on and so on. So these were good. Now that is complemented with this universal child allowance, and these three programs make majority of social expenditure in Kosovo now. That's really good. But then there are also things that were done wrongly, especially, for example, the privatized pension. We have again pension system that is most privatized in this area, and that is now we have seen during the pandemic with all these withdrawals that really they are doing a poor job. Most people, old people spend them very soon after they retire, so they become a burden of families. This then traditionalizes the society, re-traditionalizes it, and so on. We spoke earlier about the shortcomings in mean-tested programs. So it's not a one-directional story. There were good things and things that can be improved now, especially since we are speaking about the left and more, so to say, local voice. Maybe this can help, and the practices of other countries can help, improve this mix.
Maya, would you like to maybe connect here in terms of how you see either the EU's role or also just in general international aid structures in Macedonia, the kind of leverage or role that they've played?
Yes, I would absolutely agree with Artan that we first definitely need more local voice, because a lot of advice has come in by the international organizations since the 90s in our region, which was not always non-problematic, or it was not always contextualized or tailored according to the specifics of our region. Macedonia, particularly before even becoming a EU candidate country in 2005, already was in a way reformed according or modeled according to these approaches that were favored by the World Bank and were not contradicted by the local actors. I'm thinking here particularly on the pension reform which was introduced, or the reform of the pension policy which as a process was initiated at the beginning of the 90s or late 1999 and was actually finalized in 2005. So when the EU became more prominent actor, it was already in a way, so to say in brackets, too late to intervene or to have more this European or comprehensive or more favorable approach. So in a way, the technical and financial support that comes through the international donors is always good in our countries which still lack enough economic growth to finance these reforms, but it's not unproblematic. Some of our colleagues have already spoken. We mentioned Paul Stops already in our previous discussions that it's this process of EU or European integration is not linear. It's not a modernist process only of catching up and convergence, but also it involves a lot of language which is focusing on paradigms that are not yet there in our countries. We speak about social investment, flexibilization, harmonization, mainstreaming, but whether we are at that developmental stage that we really need to focus on these priorities in another issue. So yeah, focusing or giving more voice to local advice as well is also of crucial importance. So that's why I'm really thankful for you for providing us the platform today to speak about these issues.
Thanks, Maya. We've talked about also moments of crisis and then how they show the importance of social protection. And so we talked a bit about the pandemic, lessons learned through that, how they're being applied with the inflation crisis, upcoming energy crisis. And then always there's some maybe crises that seem very much further down the line. So we believe that we don't need to worry about them at the moment. Do you see this with regard to pensions in the pension system in the region? Because we have an aging population. There's high migration of youth. So that means that a lot of that is going to fall on state budgets to continue covering the pension system. Is this a crisis? Should we consider it and treat it as a crisis and actually start from now to develop responses? How do you, both of you, see this?
In terms of Macedonia, I already mentioned that in 2005, Macedonia reformed its pension system and introduced this second pillar of compulsory financed capitalized pension system. So this is a private pillar, which 40% of the overall pension contribution goes to this on own personal account. So in a way, it is prepared, the system is somewhat prepared to deal with further demographic and economic shocks, demographic mostly. But in terms of other associated risks, such as migration, such as low birth rates, again, in a way that people are moving from the country, to what extent this makes the system prepared, it's another question. So I think what we will see is definitely continuation of this dual contribution from the budget, which will take up also a lot of funds going as a substitute to the lowering contributions, which will probably happen due to migration mostly.
In the case of Kosovo, I think, because we mentioned it in the article as well, the expenditure generational wise looks more balanced, but it comes due to the fact that we have a very broad coverage with pension programs, but we don't pay much. So the problem is we need maybe to create something in between this basic pension and this individual savings. So some form of social insurance, which would guarantee a little bit higher income for the retirees, and which is guaranteed, and something like that. We need a better protection if we want to not re-traditionalize the society. So if we want the elderly not to be a burden of their family members, we have to think about that. But that should be moving in parallel with the other programs, the improvements in other directions. For example, you cannot have revenues that rely mostly on consumption taxation and then not have universal benefits and universal services, because then you create really perverse redistribution. You are taking from the poor and you are sending it to the more better off. So you have to improve the system in that direction. Especially, I think we lack in the services. Early childhood education and care, for example, is ridiculously bad. I mean, only about 6% of the child population, 0 to 6 years old, are covered by ECEC services. Increasingly, most of them from private services, and this then explains why there is so low female employment rate, and why it really maintains these gender inequalities, implants future social inequalities, and so on.
Okay, and I think we're coming close to the end, but I wanted to, for a closing question, to again ask you about something that you bring up in your paper, is that you talk about how the GDP in the region has grown over time, but that this has not necessarily improved social welfare for the most disadvantaged groups in society. How, and in the context of this entire conversation that we had now, how can we make sure that whether there is good development, like an increase in GDP and whatnot, that there's also more requests, let's say, from the public for social protection to be expanded and to be amended as needed? Why have we not seen also this growth in GDP reflected in how these schemes are set up? Either of you, Maya, maybe we can begin with you.
Yes, well, why we haven't seen, I already mentioned previously this stigma perception as how we approach the overall expansion, as seeing it as a misuse if it's potentially bigger. Definitely, we need to focus on this welfare state building in terms of more equality, social mobility, and collective welfare as a focus in the future, rather than just thinking of targeted population and quantitative objectives. So I hope we see a change in the, not only policy actions, but also more critical voices advocating for a comprehensive social welfare, which is accessible, first of all, to many people, and hopefully such initiatives will be bottom up and not really arbitrary. Thank you.
Yeah, because as we say also in the article, you need to for GDP growth to reflect on social protection growth and growth of expenditure. You need these programs to be somehow tied to GDP growth, and they are not. For example, in Kosovo, some of these programs that were put forward by the World Bank, they were tied to the extreme poverty protection thresholds. So in that sense, then GDP grows, but social protection expenditure will not reflect it. So they are not tied. So as Maya said, then you need reforms that improve generosity of these programs. But also sometimes, these ideas of privatization and this stigma of, misunderstandings about socialism, about, our contexts, they are so impactful. I see it reflected even in the discourse of ministers in the left government today, for example. Or, for example, the left government says, we will do another reform on minimum programs and the whole social protection system, maybe with a World Bank project. And that's not so encouraging, because you expect them to think themselves and to speak with all social partners and so on, much more to think about poverty, to think about pensions, to think about maximizing employment, to think about, and there are historically crises or huge developments, like, for example, Cold War or now emigration, could be as massive out-migration, could be incentives for government to start to compete citizenship-wise with countries in Central Europe if they want to reduce out-migration, because political and civic citizenship is really not enough for most people. That's why these services and the rights at work are really important to improve the quality of the citizenship, and maybe they can serve as incentives then to improve the overall democracy here.
And if I just, sorry, just to add something, I mean, I think also our governments are very permissive in a way, or want to be cooperative with the international agencies. So they always support, regardless of the specific of the offer. So we have social policy ministers who in one drawer have a World Bank reform proposal, in the second EU, in the third someone else, and it's all okay. It's all will be accepted. It's like like pushing a brake and a gas at the same time. So we definitely need to have a specific prioritized actions within social protection. You cannot have them all. It's welcoming to have the financial support from all of this, but they all have to be mainstreamed towards national specific goals. So I think this is what we are lacking also in the region.
And of course, I mean, these international organizations have a lot of big role to play, and they are very important. They have expertise to provide and all that. And then there is a globalizing world, a lot of transatlantic programs and transfers and everything, but still states have a role to play. That's why they are there. And also local levels. And why not maximize their use?
Yes, and also I think ultimately papers like yours are also very important, because we began the conversation with lack of data. But I see actually the type of research that you've also done very important, is because it fills that gap that existed in terms of also knowledge, but also local, I think, context, and understanding the local context and producing that knowledge locally. Thank you both so much for this truly insightful conversation. It was great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, Maya and Besa.
Other Talking Points is a K2.0 podcast. You can listen to it regularly on our website, kosovo2.0.com, or by subscribing to Kosovo 2.0 on Spotify.